Hi, I'm Eoin Coveney. I'm an illustrator and comic artist from Cork, and I'm very happy to be taking part in this Alliance Francaise Dublin live event. During this presentation, I'm going to be talking about my mainstream comics work mostly, and bringing you through the process of how I bring a script from the written word to the thumbnail stage to pencils all the way through to finished art and how it appears in final print. So just bear with me, I'm going to move the camera so you can see a bit more clearly what I'm talking about. So, I've always said that the script is king in any story, and my job is really to follow that script, to serve it, and to give the reader all the visual information they need to know what's happening and what's important. That's my first consideration before thinking about how hopefully great the art will look in the end. It's all about the storytelling for me at the beginning. So without getting into too much detail, this first panel of page 1 of a new story describes a crowd of people in a field in Edwardian England surrounding a dead body. So the first thing I think of is, how am I going to arrange this picture so we can get all the important visual information that we need to know what's going on, basically. So I started with this angle here, which is the overhead angle, which I thought worked fine in terms of visibility. We can see all the characters, we can see some of the setting, but I really didn't go with this one primarily because I found that the corpse, who in this case is sort of the star of the show, or this particular shot, and this is a horror story after all, I thought the corpse just appeared very, very small in this particular shot. So I opted for a combination of these two shots, which lowers the camera. I'm always thinking in terms of a three-dimensional space when I draw a comic. I try to think of it as a set with a camera. And my question to myself is, where do I put the camera in order to give the reader the maximum amount of information so they know exactly what's going on and there's no confusion? So I opted, like I said, for these angles, which I thought psychologically as well, it's more interesting. It adds more depth to the picture. The corpse is in the foreground. There's the shock value there. Plus, we can clearly see the cast of characters, and most importantly, there's a lot of space here against a white sky for very important speech balloons. It's always a challenge to leave the right amount of dead space for a speech balloon. So having worked up the shot, as it were, I then proceed to pencil. And the pencil looks like something like this. And you can see all of the important information is clearly visible. The corpse is clearly visible and nice and shocking and brutal. It is a horror story after all, like I said. Also, I opted to have a Dutch angle on this because sometimes in a comic page, when everything is in terms of X and Y, everything is up and down, it sometimes helps to try and fight that a little bit and not have everything arranged in the panel that's exactly vertical or horizontal. It tends to kind of box it in, I think, and make it seem a bit flatter. So that's one of the reasons I chose this Dutch angle. Let me zoom out a little bit more now, and I'll talk a little bit about the ink, which is this. Pardon me, just put that in the background for the moment. So, this is very typical of my hand-drawn comics work, which is not something I actually do anymore. I work exclusively digitally now. I can't say I miss the days of ink and smears and splodges and waiting for things to dry, but I do love working with real materials, but I find the simulation is very, very compelling that I can get from the iPad Pro. This is what I use primarily to ink. It's a Hunt 101 metal dip pen, and I just use old school, well, in those days I would use old school brushes like these, something like this for dry brush textures and something like this for large areas, and also for big bold sweeps like here, especially on fabric. I find that the brush sort of fosters the feeling of drapery in fabric more so than the very hard line you would get from the dip pen. So here's another page from the same story, a bit further on. And I'm just going to hold it up to the light so you can see. Hopefully that's not distorting too much. You can see that's just basically real ink. Sometimes I leave little areas unfilled, which I could just basically fill them quite quickly with the paint bucket in Photoshop. That's all moot now since I'm completely digital. But really, for this opening shot, is one of my favorite shots from that series. It's really, like I said, it's all about visual information, about providing the information to the reader, where they are, who's in the shot, what are the important things, just like a film, really. I mean, there's a shot for every reason, or rather, there's a reason for every shot in a film. Images aren't just thrown in arbitrarily. It's shown because it's important. You're the filmmaker, or in my case here, the comic artist. I'm saying, look, this is important. Look at this, which is why I place the destination, basically. Where are they headed? They're headed to this village where a bulk of the action in the story will take place. I love horror. I developed this particular heavy cross-hatching approach for this story because I felt it really worked very well for the era. It's Edwardian England, and having researched a lot of images and press from the time, I discovered that photography didn't really feature because of technology. So really, plate illustration was king in those days. So every news report or major news report had an illustration done in this very heavy cross-hatching. Not sure if that's going to focus now. But the style just felt right, so a lot of it is really intuition. For a later story, a future shock, you'll notice that there's a lot less cross-hatching here. Square. This was actually from a script by Rory McConville, who's a Cork writer, so it was a bit of an honour to be part of the first all Cork team, working for 2000 AD. So for this particular one, I used barely any cross-hatching at all. I just stuck with very stark black and white because it's a tribute to Star Wars, really, and I just don't think cross-hatching would really work for that sensibility. For this particular one, I needed to do quite a bit of design as well, because I didn't want to, have this huge space battle all penciled, and then for the editor to suddenly say, actually, no, those spaceships are a little bit too like the real thing, changing. So what I did first was I ran by the design with the editor. I made sure, look, are these craft, are they sufficiently of the style of Star Wars that you're looking for, or are they far enough away that you're not going to worry about, potential legal action? So once that was okayed, I was able to proceed with a lot more confidence. Here's another page from the Alienist series. This is towards the end. It was a 40-page story, and I feel I was kind of loosening up a good bit by this stage. I had more confidence in the characters. I knew the characters better. The more you draw them, the more you feel you know them, the more consistency you can give to them. And by this stage, I had discovered Sergio Toppi, the incredible Italian illustrator, and I think definitely some of his influence was beginning to creep in by that stage. So I'm going to take a little pause now, and I'm going to give you a little demo of how I would ink one of these typical things, and you can sort of see how it works, how I approach it. Okay, hi. So welcome back. I've just got this old pencil, and I've printed it out on a fresh piece of Bristol board, just to give you an idea of how I would normally approach this. So what I normally do first is I go in with a large brush, or a fairly large brush, something with a nice point on it, and what I'll start to do is start to pick out large areas of black, big wrinkles primarily, that I can get something down quickly and sort of break the duck, as it were, try not to get too precious about it, and just basically get into it that way. You start to loosen up as you do it, get into a rhythm, and you start to see the ink emerge from the pencil. So all these little bits, I would normally correct them in Photoshop, but that's obviously moot these days. Really, when I'm inking as well, I'm trying not to just trace it. I'm trying to think consciously of, what is this I'm describing? What's this made of? What's this stuff? Is it skin? Is it grass? Is it rock? All of that is going to have a bearing on how I move the brush and the pen, and how I describe that texture, that form. So here I am, just getting into the smaller details in this face here. Who doesn't love drawing zombies, huh? I suppose the one thing I would miss about the old traditional inking is those happy accidents, Although I would have to say most accidents are unhappy when it comes to inking. Most of them are, oh my god, how am I going to save this with white gouache? Or in the old days, I suppose, before Photoshop, you can sort of redo anything, even when it's done manually, but it still doesn't feel like that when you're making the mistake. So you can see as well that I make the marks quite quickly, and that's not only because I'm conscious of time. In fact, I would say that's probably the least of my motivations. I do believe that the more freely you express those marks, I think the reader and the viewer really is going to recognize how you felt at the time. And if I approach it in a very stilted, very nervous way, I really think that's going to be obvious when that person sees it. There'll be something about it that's just stilted, stiff, cautious. So I tend to do the marks really quite quickly. I like them to have an energy to them that I think is going to be very visible to the person who's looking at this. So I'll put the brush aside for a second now, and I'll show you how I pick out the finer details in pen. Right away you can see the range, even with that, the range of thicknesses and marks that you can get from the Hunt 101. It's a very expressive pen indeed, and indeed it's the most popular pen with comic artists worldwide apparently, and I can really see why, because you can get everything from a barely visible hair to a really bold stroke that almost would mimic a brush stroke. Obviously when you're doing digital work you don't need to keep dipping, but honestly you don't even notice it after a while, or I don't. I think you just become preoccupied with the image really, and that's really all I'm paying attention to, Now obviously this is not quite as refined as I would normally do it, because I'm working around a tripod here. I normally don't have that encumbrance, but I think this gives you a very good idea of how I normally wield this particular tool. The paper I'm using, incidentally, I might have mentioned it before, is Bristol board, which is also a very popular surface for comic artists to work on, because the reason I like it is I should say liked, because I work on digital paper now, was because it was a very smooth surface that would take a lot of punishment from the pencils, because when I'm penciling, I'm erasing almost as much as I'm drawing, or I should say erasing and redrawing. So the paper does take a lot of punishment, and I generally, in traditional work, I'll use a 6B pencil, which leaves quite a strong trace. So I think with Bristol you can really pencil a lot, make a lot of mistakes, erase a lot, and the paper will still, at the end, you still have, when you erase all the pencil lines, you still have a nice clean ink. I have to be careful I don't lean the heel of my hand into this and ruin everything that I've done up until now. Generally, what I try to do, actually, when it comes to erasing the pencil, if I have the time, and I usually do when I'm working for 2000 AD, because the deadlines are quite long, and I can fit in that work in between my other commercial projects, I'll basically leave the pencil overnight and come back and erase the pencil the next day, because it's happened to me so often. I wait an hour and a half, even longer. You think, oh well, it's definitely dry by now. And you confidently sweep across with your putty rubber, and whoops, there's a bit that's still wet. So it really is quite amazing how long ink can stay wet on a stock like Bristol board. But it's really worth it, because what I'm looking for with any paper stock is a nib that doesn't get caught in the grain, and I ensure that doesn't happen by, number one, not pushing the nib away from myself like this. Never. So I'm always pulling it towards myself or pulling it away from something. But the smoothness of the paper also ensures that there are very few incidences where the nib is going to get stuck and then suddenly released, and you get this. That's lovely if you're looking for something like Ralph Steadman's. I mean, he leans into that, but my style is obviously a lot different to Master Ralph. So I'm looking for basically predictability and as few ink splatter happy accidents as possible. I would say I ink at about twice the speed, I should say, of my penciling. So this page probably took me about 2 days to pencil, and I would say I inked it in about 6 hours, 7 hours maybe. Inking really is sort of the reward for me after I've worked, I would say 99.9% of the subject out in pencil form, so I really know what I'm describing by the time I ink, so I can really sort of let rip and be spontaneous as far as it's possible to be spontaneous in this kind of very deliberate comic art. So I'm going to pause it there. I think that gives you a good impression of how I basically work with a dip pen, and I'll finish with a little segment of digital inking. So I'm going to do a quick bit of digital inking now on the iPad Pro. I went fully digital about 2.5 years ago, and still use it for about 99% of my work. So I have the brush all set up. I'm just going to basically do a few minutes of this, and you can see how it sort of how it differs maybe. So let's get cracking. By the way, this is a Judge Dredd pin-up that I sold to 2000 AD last year. It was published in, I think, March last year. So let's start with a few big sweeps. As you can see, the response is more or less instant. There's no lag, as there can be with some other devices that I'm aware of. I'm using, I think Syrup is the selected brush. It's a standard Procreate brush which I have tweaked and edited according to my own preferences, so I have no drawing assist on. Most brushes, when you load them up first, will have a thing called Streamline, which is basically a drawing assist, and that's always off, 100% off for me, because I want the closest simulation possible to the real deal, you know. I do a bit of detail in the face that's a little bit more interesting. Well, one thing you don't have with real ink is an undo. It's very handy. So you can see what a lot of range pressure-wise this pen offers. I mean, look at that. I mean, that's a huge amount of variation in expression, so I tend to leave the point size a little bit bigger than maybe I'm comfortable with, so it forces me to be quite gentle when I need to be, and then when I need to be bold I can go big. It's a bit too small now. It's always fun to draw agonized faces, don't ask me why. I suppose living vicariously through your characters without the pain is sort of fun. Let's have a look at Dredd, since he's sort of the hero. My Dredd is really a sort of a distillation of my favourite artists' treatment of Dredd. So there's a lot of Cam Kennedy in my Dredd, who's my absolute favourite 2000 AD artist of all time. And a bit of Ian Gibson as well. And some Bond, Brian Bond. It's unavoidable. I copied him a lot as a kid. It sort of leaves an indelible mark somehow. again, you can see how fast I'm doing this. Really, I found digital inking very liberating when I was able to reach the level of expression that I felt was possible. Because you know you can undo. It's very liberating indeed, because it gives you that extra bit of confidence, because if you screw it up, you just undo. Okay guys, I'm going to leave it there because I'm conscious to try and keep the whole presentation under a certain amount of time. So thank you so much to the Alliance Française again, and I hope that some of you found it interesting and educational, hopefully, and I hope to see some of you in person again at the Alliance Française Dublin. Thanks.